This is Kaiser Broadcasting. Channel 61, WKBF TV, Cleveland.
We're now going to have a history lesson on Channel 61. In 1968, Cleveland had three network affiliate stations, channels 3, 5, and 8, NBC, ABC, CBS affiliates. They had all signed on in the late 40s, and they all came in very clear on most televisions. There was also a station, Channel 25. Channel 25 signed on in 1965. By 1968, it was educational television still, the NET network. It would become PBS the following year, 1969, when PBS was formed. And that's how we know it today, WVIZ, Channel 25, PBS. Those were the only stations in Cleveland, the number 7 biggest city in the country in 1968, and an even bigger TV market because it also included Elyria, Akron, and Canton, as it still does today. So in this region, there was 3, 5, and 8. There was Channel 25, and then down in Akron, there was Channel 23, an ABC affiliate, and Channel 17 in Canton. So into that fray, Kaiser Broadcasting, started by Henry J. Kaiser of Kaiser Shipyards and Kaiser Motors and Kaiser Permanente. Kaiser Broadcasting went on a bit of a building spree. In the late 1960s, they built stations in Chicago, San Francisco, Detroit, and Channel 61 in Cleveland. That's the K and WKBF. So they got everything together. They did construction over the winter of 67, 68, and they actually got delayed by a few weeks. So finally on January 19th, the station was ready to sign on, January 19th, 1968, and a snowstorm delayed them even that day. Finally, later in the day, they signed on with this message: "We made it, Cleveland." And you'll notice there's no comma. This is how I've always seen it written. So reading it this way would make it seem that they turned something into Cleveland. We've turned something into Cleveland. We made it, Cleveland. That's not what they meant, obviously. They meant, we made it, Cleveland. I have no idea if the comma was originally there or not, because there's very, very little film or video or even audio still existing from Channel 61. There's a little bit, and all that's out there that I've been able to find we're going to experience in just a few moments. Part of the reason for that is local television, local stations couldn't afford to buy the big, huge reels of tape that were required back then that were very expensive and difficult to store. They couldn't afford to buy those and archive things. They would buy them, reuse them, and reuse them over again. And even the networks did that. That's why so much network television from before the 1980s is lost. You know, most of the first 15 years of the Tonight Show is just gone until about 1970. Hollywood Squares, so much of that is gone. Doctor Who, a lot of those episodes are gone. That's in Great Britain, of course. So there's very little still existing from Channel 61. But they signed on, and since they weren't a network affiliate, they decided they were going to distinguish themselves in other ways. They promised that there would be a live, in color, because that was a big deal back then, variety show each night. I can't really find any information about that, so I don't know that it ever happened. That was in early press materials. They distinguished themselves with Cincinnati Royals games. That was the basketball team in Cincinnati. And this is 2 years before the Cavs existed, so that was the only game in town up here. They were also going to show programs like the Flintstones, I Love Lucy, Perry Mason, reruns of those. That was a lot of the schedule. A movie every evening. And then the main thing that they were going to show was a 10 o'clock newscast anchored by John Harrington. He was a reporter who came here specifically to do this in 1968, but that only lasted about 2 years. It was the first 10 o'clock newscast in the country. It was the last one that we'd have in Cleveland, Northeast Ohio, until about 1988 when they tried it on Channel 43. And most stations, as I mentioned, as now, had an 11 p.m. local newscast. Well, since there was no network programming to clear on Channel 61, they did it at 10, but it never worked out. This is John in the 1970s reporting for Channel 3. When the newscast on Channel 61 went away in 1970, he headed over to Channel 3 and worked there for many years, and then eventually he passed away in 2007, on my birthday, actually. So by the early 70s, the station was not doing as well as they had hoped, for reasons I'll go into in a moment. But there is one thing that they had that no other station had that helped them out, that kept the lights on and made them quite successful, and that was reruns of Star Trek. Star Trek ran on NBC from 1966 to 1969, and after that it went into syndication. I've read that WKBF Channel 61 specially got black and white prints, high contrast black and white prints of the show to run on their station. I don't know if that's actually accurate. I don't know if it ran in color or in black and white on WKBF. But and there were many stations even back then around the country that were still not color. But the Star Trek reruns were quite popular with young people, and in fact, there's some audio existing of promos that were done over the credits of other shows promoting Star Trek that was going to be coming up. One of them even features Leonard Nimoy. So let's take a listen to those right now.
Kirk and Spock fight for their lives against their mortal enemy, Thor, in Star Trek, next on Channel 61.
This is Mr. Spock of the Starship Enterprise. Logic would dictate that if you are a fan of fast-moving adventure, you'll stay tuned for Star Trek. That's Star Trek, coming up next on Channel 61.
Along with the reruns of Star Trek, there was also the late-night horror host that every station seemed to have back then, named The Ghoul, and he was the successor to Ghoulardi, of course, who's very well known. I don't have any footage of The Ghoul, of course, on Channel 61. I'm sure it's out there somewhere, and apparently it was even run on the Detroit station that was owned by Kaiser Broadcasting at one point. But I don't seem to be able to find any of that footage. I believe the gentleman who played the Ghoul is very protective of that, and so maybe he's got some from Channel 61. Someday, maybe in a future episode of KB Time, we will try and find out, but I don't have it at the moment. And the other thing that distinguished WKBF, that kept them somewhat popular, was a show called Captain Cleveland. And I'm not clear on the details, but it seems that Captain Cleveland was an unseen, off-camera being. And most of the show, this was a children's show, most of the show consisted of a ventriloquist from Cleveland named John Slowey and his puppet named Clem. And two of the clips that still exist are from that show. These are video clips. They were videoed at the time when they went out in the air, and then captured on film, and then used in a sales tape that Kaiser put together in the late 60s for their 5 new stations. And there's 2 clips that exist that were in that. One is with the mayor of Cleveland at the time, Carl Stokes, the first African-American mayor of a major American city. And the other clip is with the Vice President of the United States, Hubert Humphrey, who came here and appeared on the show.
But this is the thing that all boys and girls ought to remember, that you can be anything that you want to be in America if you get your education. But even if you happen to be one of the boys and girls who dropped out of school, you can always drop back in.
You're a good citizen, aren't you, Clem?
I'm going to try.
You know how to be a good citizen?
How do you be a good citizen?
Well, you try to be a good neighbor.
Good neighbor.
You try to be a good friend with your young friends.
Good friend,
You
yeah.
try to mind your daddy and your mom.
I do.
And when you go to school, you try to do a good job in school. Get good grades and listen to the teacher. And play fair and square when you're out in the playground.
Yeah, don't cheat.
And don't do any of that cheating business.
No.
And then always have always like the flag and respect the flag of your country.
I do.
And try to be a friend with the policeman.
They're my friends.
They ought to
Yeah.
be your friends. Policemen ought to be the friends of every little boy and girl.
Sure,
and you
but-
just go right up to them and say hello and say,
And they
I'm
say
your
hello
friend.
back.
Yeah, they'll
Sure.
help you.
Yeah.
Now, that's part of the way of being a good citizen.
There was another local show on WKBF, and it was a talk show hosted by Alan Douglas. They call him a quizmaster, I think, in the sales tape. And Alan Douglas was a radio personality, very controversial, outspoken, liked to get into it with guests. And he'd been on radio in Detroit, and then he came here. And eventually he ended up on Channel 61 hosting a program. I've seen different ways that they've credited it. Sometimes it's called Alan Douglas with a question mark. Sometimes it's called Newsroom Cleveland Today. But regardless of what it's called, he had a show on Channel 61 for a couple of years. There is a brief clip existing of that was also in the sales tape.
Tonight, a no-holds-barred, no-nonsense, just what do you mean confrontation with a black militant who has written a book called Look Out, Whitey, Black Power's Gonna Get Your Mama, and a curious visit with a young woman from West Virginia who has now twice attended her own funeral and says she enjoyed them both very much.
So with programs like that, how did they not stay on the air? Alan Douglas would eventually leave the station. He'd be on radio, and then he went to Channel 5, WEWS, to host a modern version, then modern in 1972, version of the 1 O'Clock Club, which was a roundtable sort of coffee clutch type program, if you will. And that show that Alan Douglas started hosting from its debut in 1972 was The Morning Exchange, which is very well known in Northeast Ohio. It was actually the model for Good Morning America on the ABC network, because Channel 5 was an ABC affiliate. But Alan Douglas left after less than a year as host of The Morning Exchange because his wife was found dead. She was believed to be a suicide. And so he actually packed up, moved to New York City to be on WNBC, and never quite fit in there, never cared for it, and then eventually he killed himself in the mid-70s. So it was really a tragic end to his story, but he nevertheless is a footnote in the WKBF story. And the WKBF story lasted about 7 years. At one point in 1973, Kaiser Broadcasting sold part of their interest in the station to Field Communications, which also owned TV stations, and then Kaiser Field bought a portion of Channel 43, WUAB. WUAB went on just a few months after WKBF in 1968 from studios in Lorain, Cleveland, if you remember those old IDs. And WUAB had similar type of programming, not the same shows, but similar slate of shows. They weren't a network affiliate. They did not have a newscast, I don't believe, until much later, the late 70s. And so the two stations really battled it out, because 3, 5, and 8, they were fine. They had network affiliations. Channel 25, educational TV, did okay. Even the channel from Akron, Channel 23, they had a radio station that helped them keep the lights on. And of course they covered Akron and Canton. But channels 43 and 61 were really butting heads a lot, and 43, they also were partly owned by United Artists Broadcasting, and they just pulled ahead of Channel 61. So finally citing that and saying there hadn't really been a lot of market growth for Channel 61, and they had really suffered by having a competitor come on right at the same time, pretty much. On April of 1975, after an episode of Perry Mason or an episode of I Love Lucy, I've still not gotten confirmation on that, the station went dark. And for the next 6 years, the Channel 61 allocation stayed dark. In 1981, it was resurrected by a whole different group of owners and completely separate, called WCLQ, Channel 61. And they had a similar slate of programs, reruns, movies, that sort of thing, a little bit of local programming. They brought back The Ghoul on WCLQ for a time. And they also had, every night for a while, reruns of Saturday Night Live. The first 5 seasons of Saturday Night Live went into syndication in 1980, the ones with John Belushi and Gilda Radner and everybody, and the original cast, not the ones after. And they were hour-long edited episodes, which maybe you saw on Comedy Central or E! In the 1990s or 2000s. So here now is one last piece of Channel 61 history, not from the WKBF days, but from when it came back in 1981 as a completely separate station named WCLQ. Today that allocation is for the Univision affiliate, and for many years, from about the mid-80s until about 2000, it was the Home Shopping Network. But in the WCLQ days, when they had Saturday Night Live reruns on every weeknight, here's a commercial from that era.
Rock, this is a great place to find foxes! Hey, foxes, you want to go back to a swinging bachelor bed with two wild and crazy guys? Too bad the foxes will miss Saturday night on Channel 61. It's on every Monday through Friday at 7 o'clock.
Saturday night, sure.
Walk this way. It must be our after show.